My name is Sehar Tariq, and I am a feminist. And we are here today to talk about something which is deeply feminist, in my opinion. And so, this doesn't mean that the boys should run away, they should especially stay and listen. But we are here today to talk about the astonishing and fascinating reign of Nur Jahan, the Mughal Empress. And we are here to discuss this fantastic and fabulous book, which was, I think, one of my most favorite books that I have read in recent years. And it has been written by Professor Ruby Lal, who's going to join us today for this ThinkFest conversation. This is the seventh in the series of the ThinkFest conversations. And this is really a platform to bring people together to discuss ideas, books, and academic work. And we're delighted to have a very distinguished scholar joining us today. So let me introduce our guest to you today. Professor Ruby Lal is joining us from the United States. She is an acclaimed historian of India. Her recently published biography, Empress, The Astonishing Reign of Nur Jahan, it has won the Author of the Year award in biography. It was a finalist in history for the LA Times Book Prize and amongst the top 10 picks of the Time magazine, the Telegraph, and the Prospect magazine, London. Ruby is a professor of South Asian history at Emory University, and she divides her time between Atlanta and Delhi. And we're very lucky to have her join us for this ThinkFest conversation today. So welcome, Ruby, to the conversation.
Thanks, Sahar. I'm very, very pleased to be here. It's a delight to be talking to you.
Excellent. So, Ruby, we're going to sort of jump right in and start talking about the Empress Nur Jahan. There is a lot of myth in South Asia that surrounds her. You know, we sort of have these Bollywood-esque portrayals of her in our minds. She's this bejeweled, bedecked queen who's married to a Mughal prince. But that generally seems to be the only or sort of the most enduring idea that people have about her in their minds. Who really is Empress Nur Jahan? Is she just yet another Mughal queen who is married to a Mughal prince and therefore famous? Or is there something truly special about her? So we'd love if you could introduce us to this fascinating figure.
Yes, I think that's a great question. And the best way to introduce Nur Jahan, there are many, many ways, but here is, in my view, the best way, which is why I've written this book. And for a reason, I call it Empress, the Astonishing Reign of Nur Jahan. So when we think of the great Mughals, of South Asia, we think of male Mughals. Well, there was one woman amongst them who has been forever written out of history, only one woman. And the interesting thing is that she was not from the Mughal family. She came from an aristocratic family in Iran. Her parents, her father, Ghayas Beg, who became one of the most eminent courtiers of the Mughal court, he migrated from Iran to India in the late 1570s, and Nur Jahan was born on the road outside Kandahar. It's a beautiful moment, almost iconic. But as you say, it is moments of that kind. Also, the moment of love. There are stories upon stories upon stories of how besotted Jahangir, her future husband, but at that time Prince Salim, became with her. And there's this famous pigeon story, in which they meet as a young prince. He's a young prince, and she's this young, wonderful, beautiful, gorgeous woman, daughter of this eminent noble, and they meet in a garden. And there are different kinds of settings. She meets in a garden, she meets, near a reservoir. But the point is that he's holding these two beautiful, gorgeous pigeons in his hands. And he looks at her and he says, well, I'm going to the garden, or I'm going to the bath. Would you hold the pigeons for me? So she holds the pigeons. He comes back. And when he comes back, these are prized pigeons. When he comes back, he sees that she has only one pigeon in her hand. And so he says, well, where's my pigeon? So she said, Her Highness, it's flown away. And so he says, well, how did it fly away? And so she extends her hand with the second pigeon releases her grip, the pigeon flies, and she says, like that. And so he is completely besotted. And so are, the audience till this day by that story. And I say this is only one of these amazing legends. Um, the legends are amazing. They actually really tell you something about the power of the woman, but they have locked this amazing history, right, of the one woman Mughal. And the point of calling it the astonishing reign of Nur Jahan was to really situate her back in history as one of the great Mughals of India. I just want to, there's so many ways in which this can be established. So, one of the important things in Islamic thought and practice around the issue of sovereignty is who is a sovereign? The formal kind of technical symbols of sovereignty. The formal technical symbols are a sovereign is one who has coins issued in his or her name, that the khutbah is declared in the Friday mosques, and so on and so forth. So she has. Let's just share screen here, and let's just show you.
So one question while you share your screen, you say that she's the only female sort of Mughal ruler in history. Um, how is she different? I mean, she's one of 20 wives, right? What really sets her apart? Is it that she is the only woman who is actually a co-sovereign? Because, that's something which you bring out in your book, but we never really, at least in my experience growing up in Pakistan and in sort of learning about South Asian history, you don't learn that. When you learn about the great Mughals, you don't learn that there was a co-sovereign. So how did she become the co-sovereign, and what does being co-sovereign mean?
Yes, so I think let's start with the latter, which is where I was. A co-sovereign, and the book launches her as a co-sovereign. It's important to remember that she's the 20th and last wife of the fourth great Mughal Jahangir. He never marries after that. And so let's go by the technical symbols first of all, and then we'll come to more about what does it mean to be a ruling empress, not just an empress. Here are the coins that were struck, silver rupee that was struck, and it bears the name of Nur Jahan and Jahangir, and they are found in several, collections. This is a Nishan from 1620, which is an imperial order that bears her a stamp and signature, and I'm going to talk about this. This is also a technical sign of sovereignty. But let me, while we are at this images, I just want to highlight this one particular portrait that has a lot of meaning. And I'll continue to come to this portrait over and over again, but I want our viewers to just see this very closely. This is a portrait that art historians have established that it is the portrait of Nur Jahan, in which she is loading the musket. This was built somewhere between 1612 and 1617 by the master portrait maker Abul Hassan, who was called the Nadiru Zaman, the wonder of the ages, by Jahangir. Now, I mention this because one of the ways in which, and historians had not paid attention, historians who wrote kind of synoptic pieces around Nur Jahan had not paid attention to the fact of, for example, this painting, this is a source base, that hunting was an informal sign of sovereignty. Jahangir's Jahangirnama is full of references to Nur Jahan hunting, and of course hunting all sorts of birds and things like that, but hunting killer tigers. It was a sovereign right of the emperor to hunt lions or tigers, right? And so this is the sort of thing, let me just get out of this share screen and tell you that when I began writing, right, scholars, well-established scholars in Mughal history began to tell me, but Jahangir does not write about her. So I went to the Jahangirname and I saw about 36 entries on her hunting, majority of them on her hunting. And I began to put all this together. And, the fact is that it's deeply linked with sovereignty. Now, Jahangir writing, say 350, 400 years ago is not going to say Sehar and Ruby. I'm mentioning Nur Jahan because, it is a symbol of her potent power. So she has been wiped out of history for all sorts of reasons, right? And historians are complicit in that erasure from that history, because the constant belief has been that we don't have the sources to do this, that, or the other history. And this has really been my, lifelong work. My first book, which was on the Mughal Haram, really began exactly with this proposition that, why is it we made assumptions around what I call the domestic life of the Mughals, which was really essentially um, stereotyped into this one domain called the haram, and we didn't know anything about the haram except we imagined that it had all these submissive, sterile women lounging about, waiting for the pleasure of the monarch. Now, this has a very long Orientalist slash colonial history into which that image is woven. So I think the fact that we lost Nur Jahan to history, there are many, many layers to it. And so let me just point out those layers again. One is that somehow love came to dominate. Now, I'm all for love, but what is the meaning of love here, right? The fact that the emperor was besotted by her, yes, he was besotted by her, but there are plenty of reasons why he was besotted by her. And I think that pigeon story, if you look at it, is an allegory of that, besotted love. It must not reduce her biography, which is the biography of rulership. So just very quickly, I'll point.
Can I just ask one thing though quickly? You said there were good reasons why he was besotted with her. What are some of those reasons? Because even in the book and in history, when you read about Nur Jahan, it seems like she was this beautiful but wily woman who entrapped the emperor with her charms and wiles. And if she was alive today, someone would probably say, oh, that Nur Jahan is a really fast girl. She's entrapped the emperor. So was she a fast girl, or was she really like a smart and politically savvy character, as she appears in your book? What is the reality of Nur Jahan, and why is the emperor so besotted with her?
Seher, you know what? I think I would reclaim the word fast today. If she was fast, very good. If
Yeah.
there was thinking around manipulation, thinking, I mean, conniving, manipulating, stomach full, haughty, all of these words pour into history around her over time. And there is a particular moment much later on, which we'll come to later on, when this so-called nasty woman begins to happen. It doesn't begin to begin with, right? There's all sorts of adjustments. So let's start with her background, right? Her father, Ghayas Beg, as I mentioned, the most eminent noble. Her mother, Asmat, one of the most playful, women in history. Really, the image is of this agile, interesting, aesthetically driven. That's the parental background that we are talking about. This is a family that is that has great devotion to poetry writing. The Nur Jahan, composes beautiful poetry in which allusions to the divine, faith in all sorts of practices, worrying about dissension. So she's very cerebral. And then there is this 12 years of marriage with Ali Kuli in Bengal. Now, what was Bengal? Bengal was like the Western, it's the eastern provinces of India at that time, but it's like the Wild West, the first province to come under control of the Mughals. And her first husband, is posted there. And she goes there at age 17, and she comes back 12 years later after huge amount of machinations have taken place. Her husband has been murdered. Her brother in Agra is complicit in a plot to murder the emperor, but it doesn't happen. Her father has been put, he's been taken off the service for a year. So a whole range of things are happening. And so this is a woman who's learning the relationships between the center and the provinces. She's traveling. she comes to the haram, and who is she put under the charge of? Three amazing matriarchs that include the emperor's stepmother, his mother, and one other senior woman. Right? These are themselves Ruqayya Begum, Salima Sultan Begum. These are nomad women who have traveled from Kabul on to India. They've participated in all sorts of things. They take her under her wings. And it's subsequently that she meets, so she mourns, she goes over, the time of coming to grief. She very, very slowly begins to learn the wherewithal of haram life. She has never lived in the haram before. It's aristocratic mansions, which are rather different spatial arrangements. And so she has never lived in the haram before. And so her life in the haram begins with incredibly compassionate acts. So for instance, this is where the incredible heart comes in, right? She begins to design wedding dresses for women, today called the Noor Mahali, which is sold outside the Agra fort in the bazaar. And these are gorgeous dresses that are low priced so that women can afford to look beautiful at their wedding. She gives dowries for 500 women. Now, we may say, well, dowry and this and that, but we have to situate Nur Jahan in her time. That is a feminist act of enabling women to make choices, to be beautiful if you needed to be beautiful. When she gets into power, and Farid Bakri, who's one of the most prominent recorders, Mughal, biographer, if you will, he has, by the way, 365 Mughal men in these 3 volumes, and there is one woman amongst them, and he calls her Nur Jahan Pacha Begum, and also refers to her as Nawab, right? And it's the longest entry. And, he talks about these things. He talks about how attuned she was to her times. So it is a combination of these things. It's a combination of compassion. It's a combination of amazing experience. Here's the difference with other wives. The other wives, if you look at, the stories of, we can't reproduce stories of all 19 women, but in the main, they were very dynamic, very agential, extremely powerful women in their own right, but they did not have the experiences that Nur Jahan had, right? Which is being outside. So experience is really important here. And then she has, it's a feudal patriarchal world, no matter what you are. She also has the support of her father. She has the support of her husband. She has, earlier on, Shah Jahan, her stepson, is totally by her side. So it's really all of these things that facilitate her rise. But I do want to suggest, this is very critical to the question you're asking. There is also Nur Jahan behind all of this. She's the thinker. She's the doer. She's the person who is, really, we should claim these words. She's strategizing. She's thinking. She's ambitious. Which is wonderful.
And you say that, she is this way because she's had all of these experiences. So can you tell us a little bit more about sort of her ethnic heritage, her background? You're saying she comes from Iran. A lot of people, sort of talk about or have contentious issues with what are the role that, the Persians, the Afghans have played in history. And also, what is the role? Apologies for my loud dog, who's also clearly very interested in this conversation. But what is the role that she plays in bringing Shiaism to the subcontinent? She's coming from a very different tradition, and how does that play into who she is and her power?
Yes. So, here's the thing. Her parents, essentially, Ghayaz Beg and Asmat, and at that time, they have 3 children. Asmat is fully pregnant with Noor. And they leave Iran. This is the late 1570s, and this is the time when Shah Tahmasp has died, and there's a lot of dissension in the country. And it is not just a Sunni Shia, conflict that is taking in Iran. That is, but it is also the thing is that all sorts of alternate ways of being are being challenged. So mystical inclinations, for instance, right? Poetic indulgences, for instance, and Iran, just before the time that Riaz Beg leaves, Iran is a very interesting, poetic, literate, society that's very, very playful, including how playful and literate women are. And lots of scholars have written about this. And there is no, I think it is wrong to believe that there is only one fixed thing that happens in society at a particular time. So, with all the problems at that time, there are still tendencies that allow people, to be who they are, to keep to their belief systems. So, the relationship with Akbar's India, to which Gayas Beg goes with his family, is also that for a long time, Persians had been going to Akbar's India. And there was this, and I want to, it would be wrong to call it India because that does not capture the geographical ethics of this time. It's really determined by rivers and mountains. So the Persians and Arabs call it Al Hind, which is across the river Indus, and it is a world of migration. It is a world in which people move, and any number of Persians had been in Hindustan. So I'm making all these points to suggest that yes, there are problems, but there are also, migration is a way to be, right? People move for all sorts of reasons. They move for, where the cultivation of the self is really important. And yes, Akbar's, court was one of those experimental spaces to which, and then they had relatives. Now, the other important question is that culturally, Ghayas Beg and his family are Shia. And I want to emphasize culturally because in modern times, we tend to imagine very fixed identities around people, right? We think if you are a Shia, you can't be anything else. You can't be sympathetic to anything else. If you're a Sunni, you can't be sympathetic to Christians. I mean, I'll give you one example, and this is where it's one of the opening scenes of my book, which is my mother, who's a practicing Hindu, and I don't practice anything. My mother told me the story of Nur Jahan, right? As I was growing up, it's the first time I hear that story, and that was totally part of her mindset. She's a woman who says she bows her head in front of a gurdwara, she bows her head in front of a masjid, she bows her head in front of a mandir, So this really sums up the kind of ethic we are talking about, right? This is a family that is mystically inclined. So Nur Jahan is, I will say, culturally Shia, but she marries Jahangir. Jahangir is half Hindu Rajput, half Sunni Muslim. He has a Tibetan wife in the harem. There had been any number of Shia women in the family before, right? Babur's prominent matriarch wife, Maham Begum, right, was a Shia. So you have this amazing complex, and I think that is also the complex. This is a very big, political point for people like me. The history. This is a history from India we need to claim because the Hindu right wing has wiped out exactly this kind of history, right? And so that's a very long way of saying, that the people I'm writing about here are much more attuned to be in their wider cosmos, much more poetic, much more sympathetic, much more compassionate. These are words. It doesn't, we are not trying to paint a rosy picture. There's also huge amount of killing. There's, I just used earlier on the word feudal and patriarchal. There are all of these things, right? And yet Nur Jahan happens, right? That's the point we should remember.
And, I think it's an interesting point you raise, and some of our viewers are also asking this question. You talked about, women sort of being left out of history, not written about. Even in your book, you talk about, when Nur Jahan, like you said, first enters the harem, she is taken under the wing of these senior Mughal women who sort of coach her and groom her and help her rise to power, including Jahangir's stepmother, there's an aunt, there's Gulbadan Begum, and these are fully formed figures in their own right. Yet we don't hear about them in history as much. And so one of the questions we have is, um, that women being written out of history is sort of the basis of Fatma Mirnisi's book, The Forgotten Queens of Islam, as well. And our viewers are wondering, what are your thoughts on these historians who are not writing women into their books? And even in your book, you mention how sort of people who have written records of that time, who are writing what's happening in that time, and some of these are Europeans, some of them, are South Asian. They're writing about her in very unflattering terms. It's almost like, some things I guess never change, and a woman in power always really makes people uncomfortable, especially men. So they write about her as being this sort of unavailable queen who's just, not very bright. She's moody. She doesn't listen to people. Um, what are your thoughts on, one, sort of your own academic cohort of historians who don't write about women? Um, what do you say to them? And how do you then read these sources? How do you find information? So I think it'd be great to hear a little bit about your methodology. How do we rediscover these stories? You said your mother told you the story of Nur Jahan. So how do we tell little South Asian girls about our own history? And how do we give them figures to look up to that are like them?
Yeah, I think so. There's two kinds of questions you're asking, right? One is the method, and the second is what is the message here. And on the method, here's what I'll say: a classic, and here's the long-standing conversation, if you will, that I've been having in my field in Mughal history. And since we've been talking about boldness, I'll not shudder to be bold here to say that I'm the only Mughal academic who's been writing on Mughal gender relations forever, for 20 years. This is my third book, and the point really is, there's a classic question that male historians continually pose, which is that there are no sources for it. And it's an old and tired argument now, because they know that it does not hold true. Behind that question for our audience, it's a simple thing. There are sources everywhere, and you don't have to dig new sources. You have to read them carefully, and I'll tell you exactly what I mean about that. But the important thing is, when we say there are no sources, there is nothing else except male disbelief, right? You don't want to believe this. And I just showed you earlier on that incredible image about Nur Jahan holding the basket. It is held in Rampur Raza Library, a very fine collection, dated between 1612 and 17. She marries the emperor in 1611. If this was commissioned, if it began, and with Mughal paintings, the technique is that, they're kind of, they're painted over time, different parts are done, and so on and so forth. So imagine its launch in 1612, a year into her marriage. It's pretty stupendous. If it's completed by 1617, already, this is way before the Sikkas came out, this is way before her Nishan came out. It's a formidable portrait. There's one more thing I'd like to say about this portrait. Up until the time of Nur Jahan, all the paintings that were made, and the most important atelier, established atelier, was under Akbar the Great. Okay, but all the paintings of women, and there were scores and scores and scores of them, they were highly, what art historians call, stylized, which means that the painter was not directly viewing these paintings, but creating them suggestively. Nur Jahan's paintings are the first portraits under Jahangir, first to be realistically portrayed. By that I mean, obviously, Abul Hassan was viewing, right, this woman. Let me just share screen and show you one other painting, and it's not a painting, it's actually a little button that must be put in the turban, and I'll just speak about this. And so let's just
And if you could also speak about how people are reacting to these sort of, these
yes,
clips
yes,
that
I'll
are
come
coming
to
up.
that, but
We have a
just
question also on this by Nawaz Khan, who's asking, how was the Muslim clergy reacting to the addition of Noor Jahan's name into the khutbah of Jummah? Because in
yes.
addition to these public displays, her names are, she's building caravanserais that you write about in the book. She's, has coins in her name is added to the Jummah khutbah. So what is the popular reaction to this?
Yes, yes, I'll come to that, but I just want to first take on this very critical question that you're posing. What is the method and what is the message for women? And then I'll come to the reactions to Noor Jahan, which is a very important question. And actually, that is the beginning of, in some senses, her erasure in history, right? So right now we are talking about the modern erasure, that is the erasure by historians, for instance. So you have this, I said, this is actually installed in a button to be worn in the turban. And these buttons were distributed to noblemen, and they were signs of respect, they were signs of obeisance to the emperor. Now, we have any number of these paintings of the princess and the emperors. This is called a jaroka, in which the emperor came out into one of the windows or the balconies of the palace and gave viewing to the masses. How do we know that this is a jaroka painting? This is what art historians tell you. When a hand is put on the sill right here, this becomes so. We have these incredible sources, right? I'll give you another example, and then tie into other things. There's a beautiful panegyric account of Noor Jahan held in Aligarh Muslim Library. It's called Fatnama-e-Noor Jahan Begum. And it is of an incredible time in 1626, a year before her husband, the Emperor Jahangir, dies. He's captured by a nobleman and it's a 100-day captivity. And she rescues him eventually. But for that rescue, she goes out on an elephant initially and fights a big battle. Now that was too much, right? So anyway, coming to the panegyric, there's a beautiful account which historians have dismissed, that this is poetic, right? That this is a panegyric account. As a court historian, you have to ask yourself the question, what is not panegyric, right? So these are the issues as an historian I have to take on and work with these kinds of sources, but constantly make these points, and also take the legends that we began with. Why is it that we are so taken by her? Because we are really, in a way, hungry, right? Why is it that Noor Jahan is a household name in South Asia, right? And I want her to be remembered as an empress, this household name. So there are all these, the historians must rise above. I think the problem is historians believe that anything that the emperor has sanctioned must be legitimate. Well, there are lots of problems in it if you begin to get into the production of these texts, right? And this is not just my point. This is the life of feminist work, that we want to take, poetry into account. We want to take poems into account. Just very quickly, Gulbadan Bano Begum, daughter of Babar, sister of Humayun, aunt of Akbar, writes an official history at the request of Akbar the Great, right? She enables my first book that I was talking about, and now I'm going to write a whole, biography of hers. She's a phenomenal, and she is a real badass. You were asking about things.
Yes.
There's a lovely. She spends 5 years in Western Arabia, in Mecca and Medina, and there are
Yes, there's a lovely story about how she just says, I'm going on a pilgrimage. Do you want to share
yes,
that? I find it
yes.
fascinating.
But let me now come to your viewers' question about, how did the clergy respond to it? The clergy responded. So this is the interesting thing. Until 1626, there was a bit of puzzlement. but there was also a looking up to Nur Jahan in the court circles, right? We have, it's not just Jahangir who's writing about her. It's the paymaster Mutamer Khan, for example, who's writing about her. I mentioned Farid Bakri, who's writing about her. So there's any number of people who are writing about her. And it's a mixed feeling, right? Jahangir has been dubbed as this, alcoholic and drunk. He is not. I mean, he is, but he does not resign, right? He continues to hold on to the reins of sovereignty, but brings and says in so many words that I have given the reins of authority to Nur Jahan Begum. Okay, so it's a shared sovereignty that is going on.
She is yet another woman holding a man up in history then.
But the point about the khutbah is a really interesting one. The khutbah is never read in her name because there's no need to read the khutbah in her name, right? The khutbah was already read. She comes on as a co-sovereign, which is a very unusual arrangement in this history. It is only this time that this kind of, for instance, Akbar's mother, Hamida Banu Begum, takes over just the reins of Delhi when he goes to Kabul to fight against his stepbrother. But that's a very little time. So you have episodes like this, but not this 15 years of co-sovereignty. The other important thing to remember, and I talked with a lot of Islamic scholars and actually Islamic legal authorities on this issue. The status of the khutbah was very uncertain at this time, and jurists would much rather have the arrangements that they had in the person of Noor and Jahangir together, rather than get the empire into chaos. But in 1626, the moment that I was mentioning, when she goes to fight on an elephant, there's a word that begins to come into the sources from that time. And that word, we all know, it was used for Aisha during the Battle of the Camels. It's called fitna. And so, coming on the Jarokha is okay, ruling is okay, but going into war, right?
That's a step too far.
That is a step too much. And I believe historically that is the beginning of textual erasure. But before then, in 1622, she has a daughter from her first marriage, Ladli Begum. And she marries that daughter to Shahryar, the youngest prince. And that becomes too much for Shah Jahan in 1622. He goes to the Deccan, he declares a rebellion, which was pretty typical for Mughal princes to do. And that's the breaking of their alliance. And all the writing on Shah Jahan is then attached to that 1626 moment where the idea of the fitna is built over and over and over again. So that's historically the problem of erasure of Nur Jahan. And then by the 19th century, you have, first of all, the pigeon story has taken over. And then, of course, you have the colonial renditions in which she becomes an orientalized queen, so distant and so removed that we have no, feeling for her. In a couple of modern biographies, it's, as I've called, bullet point histories. People say, she did this, she did this, she did this. But what did it mean? What did her nishan look like, right? Yeah. What she says, Nur Jahan Padshah Begum, that's her stamp on the thing. If you think about it, it's incredible play with the stamp. Nur Jahan, the name she gets in 1614 informally, declared by Jahangir in 1616 for all to use. Padshah Begum, we know what that means, right? So the play with the light, Nur Jahan, she's born Mihirun Nisa, sun, S-U-N, of women. She is then called Nur Mahal, light of the palace. And then Nur Jahan, and light is Platonic, Neoplatonic, right? I mean, it's attributed, it's illuminous philosophy of sovereignty. Essentially, in very simple terms, it means that the emperor is the holder of this great divine light, and that sort of through several screens comes onto the forehead of the emperor, but it's only the very distinguished around him who can see that light. And he shares that with Nur Jahan, right? In attribution of that name. And these names are attached to towns, to the gardens, to all sorts of things. So this is the sovereignty. This is the kind of spy work in language, you know, in the wider culture of the time that an historian must do. I mean, buildings are not just aesthetic. She builds the first caravanserai, one of the most, you know, male spaces. It's on the Grand Trunk Road, and outside she chooses 4 lines. The last line is, "This sarai was built by Nur Jahan Pacha Begum." This is a sign for posterity, right?
Yes.
So what should, to go back to that great question you asked me, Seher, and I didn't respond to it. What is the message here for girls? We have models here, right? And what is this model telling us? This model is telling us, if she is going to be our model, that you need, you know, she's cerebral. You need to think. You need to strategize. You need to plan. And you can be who you want to be.
And you can rise to be, you know, empress of all of India and the Mughal Empire. So I think we have just time for two other short last questions that have come in, Ruby. Um, Something asked by Amber Shamsi and Amrita Ghosh is, I'm going to sort of combine their questions, is one, what is her relationship, Noor Jahan's relationship with other Mughal women, particularly Mumtaz Mahal, you know, who's sort of the, you know, her successor in some ways in popular imagination, you know, the Taj Mahal is built in her memory, and she's another powerful queen. So one, what is her relationship with some of these other Mughal women in that time, particularly Mumtaz Mahal? And two, Amber Shamsi and Azima Chima are asking, how does she compare to other female rulers, you know, whether in South Asia, so like someone like the Rani of Jhansi, or maybe elsewhere? How does she compare to the European queens? How does she compare to someone like Hurrem Sultan from, you know, from Turkey? Like, how does she hold up in sort of the pantheon of female leaders across the world?
Yes, I think both of those are really phenomenal questions. So Mumtaz Mahal is actually her niece, right? Her brother Asif Khan's daughter, and she's married to Shah Jahan, and they were betrothed a year. They were betrothed a few years before Noor and Jahangir became married, but they were married a year, you know, after that. So this is the other interesting thing, you know. Several accounts call her a lady in waiting when she goes to the haram, but here, you know, here she is with all this incredible family circle. It's a very interesting question about relationship with Mumtaz Mahal, and you know, I've often wondered. So Mumtaz has 14 children with Shah Jahan, and my reading and portrayal, the portrait of Shah Jahan in my mind, is this, you know, very difficult young prince, ambivalent in the beginning, but increasingly ferocious, right? And increasingly stringent is the word. He's
Lots of
fragile, but
teenage
he's,
angst, I
yes,
feel, was
yes,
welling up there.
but he's, and you know, he looks up to Akbar, and again with Akbar the image has been this, you know, eclectic. Yes, he's very eclectic, he's very playful, and he sets the scene for the kind of experimentation Noor and Jahangir does. But he's you know, if you look at the early paintings of Akbar's court, he's very ferocious, he's driven, he's, you know, after battles and so on. So it's very interesting that Jahangir rebels against him and actually really apes himself after Babar the Wanderer, nomadic. So to go back to Noor and Mumtaz, uh, it's a great puzzlement. I was in Agra interviewing several tour guides, and the tourism industry of Agra had this was several years ago, had this play in honor of the Taj. It's called Taj, the Love Story, right? And the whole image of Mumtaz was Noor Jahan. It was like Noor Jahan's story had been put onto her, right? So here is another. I had never imagined to myself that I could, because I've written about these phenomenal women in history, Gulbadan, and I mean Gulbadan. I'm now writing about Nur Jahan. I had never imagined that I would want to write about a figure like Mumtaz, who appears, and I want to underline, appears as a sorry figure in history. But there is something to be thought through here, right? Despite the 14 children, and her own husband's account, the great Shah Jahannames in various forms, only depict those 14. She births this one, now she births this one, now she births this one. But I think there's more to the story. And I'll have to, really dig deeper. The influence of Nur Jahan, without question, and she is in the family, she's her aunt, is going to be very interesting despite, the children. And one way would be that she is establishing its authority through children. She no more has the kind of space that Nur Jahan has. I mean, Shah Jahan was determined to wipe out that place in history. And one of the reasons why he orders a rewriting of the Shah Jahaname, it had been written for 10 years, he wipes it all out in the sense that he recommissions it. And he builds it by laying very categorically the male line. And still in 1645, there is a paragraph there in the Shah Jahaname, which, if you don't mind, I'd like to read, if I can find the pages, because it really links to some of the stuff that we've been talking about here. In 1645, this is what the history says. That is, according to Shah Jahan or Nur Jahan at the moment of her death. He says, in the city of Lahore, and this is in translation, the Queen Dowager Nur Jahan Begum, whom it is needless to praise as she had already reached the pinnacle of fame, departed to paradise in the 72nd year of her age. The renowned Begum was the chaste daughter of Itmadud-Dawla and sister of the late Yaminud-Dawla. From the 6th year of the late emperor's reign, that is his father, Jahangir, when she was united to him in the bond of matrimony, she gradually acquired such unbound influence over His Majesty's mind that she seized the reins of government and abrogated to herself the supreme civil and financial administration of the realm, ruling with absolute authority till the conclusion of her reign. So even if he is wiping out a woman's power, it's no matter what, she will will herself onto the pages of this history. I mean, this is with all, backhandedness. It is absolutely clear about her. So I say this because Mumtaz will have seen the splendor of this, right? She would know this.
She grew up in its shadow.
She will, she grew around her. And when Jahangir dies, Nur Jahan could have very easily gone into the harem of Shah Jahan as the elder and serve as counselor as the elder women did. She does not, right? She lives on her own in Lahore. And, what would that life be like those years after? People have painted a very sorry picture of her wearing, black clothes and kind of wandering around, the majar of her husband and so on and so forth. They forget that she builds her own tomb and his tomb after that. People like Nur Jahan will visit her. Mumtaz Mahal will visit her. So there is this influence to be charted out. I think that's a very, very important story that we have to remember. There was one other question. Remind me of the second question.
How does she compare to other female leaders, rulers, not just in South Asia, but from around the world?
Yes. So, one more time, I want to emphasize, let's take sort of Queen Elizabeth I really dies just a few, she's a contemporary of Akbar, really kind of, but there in your mind at that time. But she inherits power, right? It's in her blood. She's designated. You take Queen Christina of Sweden, right? Exactly the same story. So this is, you take Khurram actually, very
Yeah.
powerful, but she's not a co-sovereign, right?
Yes.
She's a devoted. Shah Suleiman is
Yes.
very devoted to her. Her important contribution is that in the Ottomans, concubinage was the major thing. The emperors never married. So Suleiman loves her that much, and the most magnificent poetry on her that he writes. So his humanity, his kind of vulnerability, his love, by marrying her, it becomes the first marriage. And I think that sets a very different dynamic, but she's never the ruler, right? And so Nur Jahan, by comparison, is really pretty phenomenal, as I've been saying repeatedly, right? She rises to be, which in our parlance we are calling co-sovereign, and that's what I'm situating her as, right? Pretty much the whole of Hindustan, right? Which, which is Pakistan, which is, I mean, modern day. She's, parts of Bangladesh into the Deccan, right? Really, the Deccan is not taken, but there are forays into the Deccan, and that's also the difference with Razia, right? Razia
Yes.
is the Sultana of Delhi, declared, in the family, but only of Delhi, first of all, right?
Yes.
It is not a matter of prize giving. I think we have to understand all these queens, empresses, right? In their own terms, with their own vision, with their own singularity. I think the singularity must be emphasized, right?
Ab-
Um,
And
and
I
that's
mean,
really
going back
critical.
and sort of like reading for them in the texts and the sources that exist is so important, like you said, because it's easy to say the sources don't exist, but even the male sources, like you mentioned, the Shah Jahan is, he says, I don't like that version. Give me another one, right? So obviously the emperor's own desires are a part of how history is written. It's not some accurate, ahistorical record. It's obviously loaded with his own personality and his own politics. And
Yes.
that brings me to my last question. These days in across the globe, we're having this moment where we're rethinking, revisiting a lot of historical figures. We're rethinking their legacy and we're revising and revisiting, what they meant, what their influence meant, how good they were, how bad they were. There are plenty of statues that we are tearing down, and we want them torn down. And I want to ask, if there was a statue of Noor Jahan somewhere, um, would we be wanting to tear it down, or would she withstand the test of time as a sovereign that someone could look up to, someone who was, brilliant and fantastic, or is she someone who really didn't leave the world a better place?
I think we need to install the statue.
Excellent.
Because I think this is exactly what we've been discussing. We've been discussing the fact that, a powerful, incredible. See, what's really important issue at stake here is that when we have rulers, when we have leaders, right, they are not leaders in the DNA. None of them are,
Hmm.
right? Yes, sometimes families matter, blood matters, but after all, you have intimacy and struggles between princes. They have to, prove themselves that they are militarily good, that they have huge amount of, success, that they can manage revenue, that they are far-sighted, that they have, ambassadorial skills, all of those kinds of things. And so the point is, Noor Jahan and other queens are doing precisely that, right? They are thinking, they are being made, they're vulnerable, they also make mistakes. Let's not imagine that Akbar the Great does not make mistakes, right? He makes
Absolutely.
any number of mistakes. So we need, we want more statues of women going up. I mean, what is a wider landscape? It's a male world. We have male statues, we have male ways of writing history, we have male ways of thinking, we have male way. The language is male, and by that
Hmm.
if you get into it, you really realize that even in the ways in which this is a struggle we must have. How do we leave stories for girls so that they can connect, as girls with these figures? It's a very important question. So yes, please, let's work on putting up a statue of Nur Jahan. You know, there are some wonderful painters in Pakistan who have been, Haji Muhammad Sharif. I want to mention, actually, let me just show you this image. He revived the Mughal school, and he was attached as a painter in Patiala. So he really knew the courtly circles. And how did he begin reviving Mughal painting in Lahore? When he taught by painting a series of paintings of Nur Jahan. And his nephew very kindly gave me permission to produce two of those paintings in my book. Let me, just because I've been showing this everywhere. We are in Pakistan. I want to show this one painting here. This is made by
Could you switch to the full screen or to the slideshow so everyone can see the picture?
Are you not able to see it?
No, we're able to see it, but if you could just switch to the slideshow mode, so it'll come out a little bit bigger.
I think it's not going to let me do that. So for now, we are just going to have to see it this way. But this is that moment of Nur Jahan, right? Killing a killer tiger, with which my book opens, right?
Yes,
so he got the sovereignty, and he, began with her sovereignty. So I'm a successor in that.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your time, Ruby. It has been a pleasure talking to you and learning more about Nur Jahan. And more than anything else, thank you for writing this book so that young girls across South Asia can connect with their own history. And they have someone that they can advocate for a statue that needs to be built and for a history that needs to be remembered. So thank you for your lovely and extremely important work. And thank you for joining us for this ThinkFest conversation.
Thank you, Sehar. Thank you to ThinkFest, Yaqub, and all our viewers. I'm very honored. I very much wanted to come to Pakistan, but Corona didn't let that happen. But
COVID permitting, we'll hopefully try to get you here soon so we can continue to learn about this. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.